Welcome to Basic Black. Some of you are joining us on our broadcast and others of you are joining us on Facebook and Twitter. I'm Callie Crossley, host of Under the Radar 89.7. Tonight, Juneteenth. We, like you, are dealing with the effects of the coronavirus pandemic and are taking precautions. We are working with limited staff and our guests are joining us remotely. Nearly every state in the country, including Massachusetts, has recognized Juneteenth, that pivotal day in Texas when the last group of enslaved Black people learned they were free, more than 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. Every year, Texans mark the day as a way to celebrate freedom and a new beginning. But what started as a statewide and later regional celebration soon became an African-American national cultural observance. In the last few years, outside interest in the history of Juneteenth gained momentum, especially during the nation's racial reckoning. Does the commodification of Juneteenth cheapen the significance of the holiday? And how do African Americans ensure that the historic legacy it represents is not only honored, but passed on? Joining us remotely, Annette Gordon Reed, the Carl M. Loeb University professor at Harvard University. Professor Gordon Reed has won 16 book prizes, including the Pulitzer Prize, and she is the author of the new book on Juneteenth. Lamerchi Frazier, Director of Education at the Museum of African American History. Dr. Kellie Carter-Jackson, Assistant Professor of Africana Studies at Wellesley College. And Imari Parris-Jeffries, Executive Director of King Boston. Welcome to all of you. So let me start with you, Annette Gordon Reed. You've just written the book on Juneteenth. When the General, Gordon Granger, appeared in Texas on June the 19th, hence Juneteenth for those wondering, he came with Order Number 3. And the question that many people would wonder, why did it take so long for him to come with the order to again underscore that the enslaved persons in Texas were indeed emancipated?
Well, it took him a while because the Confederate Army, the Army of the Trans-Mississippi, had kept fighting. I mean, Lee surrendered, the Army of Northern Virginia surrendered a couple of months before then in April, but they kept fighting in the Southwest. And so until the hostilities were over and they surrendered June 2nd, I believe it was, 1865, that's when Granger had the opportunity to go to Texas and make this pronouncement. I mean, people tend to think that the war ended at Appomattox, but it did not. They kept fighting. And when they surrendered, that's when Gordon Granger went to Texas and made the pronouncement.
Now, why was it that Texas had become kind of a haven for enslavers?
Well, because it was clear the state was, I should say, the state had been formed as a republic, as a slaveholders' republic. It was clear that slavery was going to be protected, and a lot of people from Georgia and Alabama left there, and particularly during the war, to escape the fighting, to get to a place that they saw, as you said, as a haven, because they had not made it down yet and the Union had not taken control of it. So it was a place where they thought they would be safe.
Kellie Carter-Jackson, as you have taught history over the years, what about Juneteenth always stood out for you and your students as you were teaching them?
I mean, for me, it was the delay. It's the idea that 2 years had passed. And while millions of enslaved people are enjoying their Jubilee, enslaved people in Texas are still waiting for that day to arrive. So I'm always I'm still struck by the delay. But most of my students are not familiar with Juneteenth. It's becoming more and more, I would say, public knowledge. But for a while, I was introducing this holiday to them because most of my students are outside of the state of Texas and had not celebrated this holiday.
When did you find out, by the way?
So I did high school in Texas, so I knew about it.
Okay, all right.
But I always thought it was interesting because I lived in North Dakota and I remember having celebrations in North Dakota and I was like, what are y'all doing? I didn't realize that, that people celebrated it outside of Texas. And I have Annette Gordon Reed's book. It's so great. And I kind of had a little bit of jealousy or pride about it too, thinking like, this is a Texas holiday.
Okay. Well, I asked the question, Lamerchi Frazier, because I knew about it for some time because I have relatives in Texas. So it was just part of the thing that we knew about. But as I became older, I realized that most people did not, and that's black folk and white folk did not know about it. But Lamerchi, you said at this moment, and what Juneteenth is really crystallized right now. Why do you say that?
I say that because this gives us an opportunity to look at what was set in place that day, Juneteenth, and that this, for me, I often wondered as I was growing up and I found out about it in high school, why does that make me uncomfortable that people are celebrating this day and not saying commemorate this day or remember this day? And as far as that was concerned, I began to look at what the order really says. And if it is a true testament meant to freedom, is it that as we acknowledge that we have land rights, land acknowledgements for indigenous people? Is it land rights that are that this is about for the Confederacy and divesting them of this area? Is it really about the Black enslaved people who are there in Texas? It sets up this dynamic of relationships for me with regard to freedom and unfreedom, as the order tells you that you're a freedman, yet it is making stipulations on that freedom to say you can't come to the military compound for protection, that you're to stay quietly in your homes. And what are those homes is my question. And if those homes were on plantations, were those really, did you give me a deed? And so in terms of what freedom really means here, and looking at the advent of you, after having worked for no wages, you are then instructed that you will be working for wages and that your idleness won't be tolerated. So as I began to look at the document itself, there were some reveals that led me to think about what Kelly's photograph of Frederick Douglass in the back of her thinks is, what to the Negro is the 4th of July. What is Juneteenth to us, really? So.
And I should underscore what you're saying by referencing specific pieces of the order is that, just to remind people, Lincoln did not, quote, free the enslaved. He was trying to preserve the Union. That was his goal. And the consequence of that was that there could be emancipation of some of the enslaved people. And to your point, Lamerchi, you're articulating what emancipation really looked like in that moment. So Imari, that's right where you live, because as far as you're concerned, this is Juneteenth should be a symbolic, but both a reminder that this is really about reparations.
Yeah, and that's right. And we're reminded that Dr. King asked President Kennedy to reissue the Emancipation Proclamation during the 60s, and so there's an importance of symbolism when we talk about Black liberation. And so what does Juneteenth mean in this era of racial reckoning? What does Juneteenth mean for Boston 8 years before our 400th birthday as a city, right? And so when we reflect on the 1619 Project and the origins of anti-Blackness and slavery and chattel slavery and us being here, 11 years later, the city of Boston was formed. And so we're at the epicenter of when many of the issues that we're talking about across the country began. 2020 was the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower landing on Plymouth Rock. And so when we talk about displacement of Indigenous people and their lands, Massachusetts is the epicenter of where a lot of these issues began. And so what's the role of symbols? And so as we're building this 20-foot memorial to Dr. and Mrs. King and 35 other Boston civil rights leaders, as we're thinking about how symbols reinforce racism, how do we ensure that there are counter symbols that reinforce the type of inclusion, the type of anti-racism, the type of welcome that we want our city to be? The embrace is one of those symbols, and Juneteenth is fundamentally another one of those symbols. It is America's original Independence Day. it is the first time that we can really articulate what it means for our attempt at living out the Declaration of Independence. And Dr. King, and during the I Have a Dream speech, referenced the Emancipation Proclamation and referenced the promissory note. And so Juneteenth is again a call for that promissory note. And it's an important symbol as we think about what does post-pandemic Boston and America look like, that there are important symbols. And just as one final reminder, Senator Brooke, which was the first popularly elected Black senator from Massachusetts shortly after Dr. King's assassination, worked to get Dr. King's birthday as a national holiday. And it took years. It wasn't until the 2000s that all 50 states recognized Dr. King's birthday as a national federal holiday with time off. And so I hope it doesn't take this long. And so it's not lost on me that Senator Markey, another Massachusetts senator, is leading the charge in ensuring that Juneteenth is a federal holiday. And so there's a history here in Massachusetts of raising up these symbols for Black Americans.
So Annette, what do you think about that? I want you to pick up from where Imari is in terms of, and also Lamerchi's concern about, is it a celebration? Is it an observance? How should we be thinking about Juneteenth, certainly as Black Americans, and this is our history, but also what do we want to say about it now that it's become more well-known and states and communities are embracing it?
Mm-hmm. Well, I endorse the idea of thinking of it as a commemoration. And what I think about is remembering the feelings of the people who heard this news. And there's no reason to doubt that they were happy about that, even though they understood that they were entering another struggle, that the answer, that everything hadn't been solved during that time period, because as soon as they began to celebrate, and they did celebrate, they were the subject of violence. There are instances where people who were celebrated were whipped by whites who didn't want them to celebrate, because Granger's order, as she said, is as you mentioned, is sort of problematic in some ways. But one thing it does that really set people off is that he talks about existing in a state of absolute equality, and that was not. I mean, it would have been one thing if he had said, "And now slavery's over, and go on your merry way." But that really, I think, incensed enslavers and whites who were not enslavers, people who were part of the racial hierarchy. So I think it's a way of thinking for us to remember that the feelings of the people who were hopeful during that time period in the face of some real hostility, real hostility on the part of the people who lost their quote unquote property, and also people who lost the opportunity, the aspiration to be able to have people as property. And so it was really, it's not we think of celebration, but think of celebrating in a circumstance where there are people who want to do violence to you. And nevertheless, 10 years after that, 4 men in Texas pooled their resources and bought land to create Emancipation Park, a place specifically to do this in the face of, 1870s in Texas is bad news, for them to celebrate this kind of thing. So I think it's remembering those people. It's not so much, we know what's happened. We've lived, we understand how long the struggle has continued, and it continues even today. But these people at this moment are hopeful with this change of circumstance in a situation where people are ready to do enormous violence to them. So I think commemorating their bravery, commemorating their hopefulness in a very bleak time is what Juneteenth is about for me. And we don't want it to become commercialized, even though this is the United States, we commercialize everything. But it's up to people who are serious about this to ride herd on this and to make sure that it's a day of education, it's a day of remembrance of those people, and something that's worthy of their struggle. So that's what it means for me.
So Kellie, you're concerned that a little bit about it's kind of breaking out of the family celebration and turning into something else because of maybe an attempt to commodify it and commercialize it, as Annette was saying.
Yeah, I think that's a real issue, when the movement becomes commoditized, when it's AT&T presents Juneteenth or Amazon Juneteenth, it has this sort of awkward feeling to it where it no longer feels legitimate when it gets co-opted by these corporations. So, I prefer to look at Juneteenth in terms of its possibility. I think that when we look at February, we look at February as Black History Month. We think about Black contributions made to this country. But when I think about Juneteenth, I think about like Black Futures Month. I think about what is possible. Where do we go from here? What should freedom look like? What should it entail? And to me, it's a very forward-facing holiday that I think all of us have to grapple with these questions about where do we go from here.
Do you agree, Lamerchi?
I absolutely, I agree with everything that's been said so far, and especially that this is a look forward to advance our causes and our opportunity in the 21st century to link and arc over those centuries, this information that will allow us to have a lens of triumph, if you will. But in that also, I'm looking at some of the instances that have happened, like when it says to stay in your homes and quietly. I think about Bree Bass, who climbed the pole in South Carolina and took down the Confederate flag. Certainly, she was not staying in her home quietly. She drove an hour and a half to get there from North Carolina to do that, knowing that she would be arrested. And then I juxtaposed that to an incident that happened in Natick 3-4 days ago on Memorial Day, where there is a white veteran who stands on the lawn and boasts the Confederate flag alongside his wife as an American veteran. And he is asked to stop and to leave. And as I'm listening for his name, it is never announced. So I'm looking at this white possessive logic and way of thinking that still puts us in this cauldron of white privilege, constructions of whiteness, and how that is across the board still. But yet, as we acknowledge Juneteenth, we have, thank God for the young people, we have a chance to pass the baton as generations who are going to be unapologetic about, freedom.
Now, so up in these corporations, because there are a lot of corporations that have given employees the day off, some of them have gone beyond that and actually have said, all right, we're going to do programs, we're going to talk about it, blah, blah, blah. But, there's a mix of what's happening. What would you want to make sure, Lamerchi, is being transmitted in those conversations with, I would imagine, a wide audience of people who know nothing about this, right?
Yes.
This is
Right. I think, first of all, looking at demystifying what this moment brings and where they are as they come to this program, what is on their minds with respect to whether they know about it or not, whether they're open to learn about it, and whether they're able to reckon with their own state and status. There is this word called allyship that has been, touted a lot, trending. But, look at the word accomplice as compared to that, to our advance of humanity and recognizing BIPOC people who are who may not be reflective of themselves in the mirror. And so as we look at that ideal of being able to examine America's Constitution and democratic principles with respect to what has been our past as we advanced from the Fugitive Slave Acts on through 1865, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, and on to today in the 21st century, and seeing what I call a Confederate knee on George Floyd's neck, seeing those kinds of things happen. Are they ready to reckon with it? Are we all ready to reckon with it and make some change?
What would you want to? Yes, somebody who Kelly, go ahead. Yes.
It's interesting because I have been, and I'm sure this has happened with Annette Gordon Reed as well, I've been asked by corporations, by nonprofits, by companies all across the country, will you speak on Juneteenth? Come speak to our employees. But they don't want to pay you anything to do work. And I think it's really interesting that companies virtue signaling about doing this programming and yet unwilling to compensate the labor that goes into producing this knowledge and getting this knowledge out to the public. So I've always respectfully declined, but when it comes to that,
decline, always decline.
Always decline. But there's
anybody who can pay you should pay.
Yeah. Exactly. And these corporations can pay.
Yeah, not for you do things for not-for-profit people that are struggling along. That's one thing, but people who should pay you always should pay you.
Should pay. We have a price structure at the museum for that.
I'm happy to give a talk for the church. I'm happy to give a talk for the high school. I'm not thrilled about big corporations that want this work pro bono. I think that's highly problematic.
Go ahead, Imari.
And I think when we reflect upon the commodification of Juneteenth, I think what's not lost on any of us is our origin story of the Middle Passage was about the dehumanization of those of us who are descendants of African-American slaves, and then the commodification of our bodies and our labor. And so the whole idea of commodifying Juneteenth is just another way in which racism commodifies Black labor, Black pain, Black assets. And so I think there has to be a stand against commodification of Blackness because it spits in the face of the whole spirit of why the holiday exists in the first place. And I think the opportunity for white Americans and other Americans to center Juneteenth in their lives, because it's also for white Americans, it's a celebration of their ability at the time to acknowledge the dehumanization of Black bodies. And so the very idea of this Karen trope being bothered by Black celebrations is rooted in this historical issue of Black joy being problematic. And so it's a Black holiday. It's our holiday. It celebrates the emancipation and the historic assets of it, but it's an opportunity moving forward for all of us to reflect on the day that America understood the humanity of all of its children, especially Black children, especially us. And so I think that is an opportunity for folks who are not Black to embrace Juneteenth as America's promise to acknowledge the humanity of all of its residents and citizens, because that is what this is about. And so the commodification of Juneteenth and Black bodies, Black labor, Black ideas, Black knowledge is just inherently problematic. And so, just to add to this stream of questioning.
Okay, I'm going to turn this in the little time I have before the end of the show to ask y'all about red drinks and red velvet cake, because that's how Black people celebrate Juneteenth. So tell them why, Annette Gordon Reed. Tell them why.
Well, why? I mean, I have heard that this red is a feature of it because of this representing the struggle of enslaved people. Strawberry pie was also something that was in it. Now, that's not a story that I heard. Someone said that it is red because Black people like red. I don't know. But that's the story. That is true. That is red as a flavor, right?
Right, that's right.
So that's what that's what I've heard is the reason for it, but it's definitely a part of it. That was key. Red soda water and anything red was supposed to be there to commemorate.
And rice.
Yes, Kelly Carter, you talk about the red Big Pop, right?
And in Texas, goat. Barbecue goat. Now, our family didn't eat goat, but lots of people that too was what you were supposed to have. And I don't know, that's interesting to me because it's not something that's common,
right?
Food in general, but that was something that was supposed to be there.
Lamercia, do you know about the red foods?
I know about the red food. I grew up in Jacksonville, Florida. So,
okay.
Yeah, we had all of that and more. The red watermelon, that was a part of the feast too. So
yeah, that's true. And in Texas, we had tamales, which are not red, but that influence
Right.
Yes.
culture
And that moment also gives
indigenous
us that
culture.
opportunity to talk about the Mexican and
Yeah.
Black relationships
That's right.
that were there. There's a cowboy by the name of George Majunkin that I've done some research on, and he was his father was an enslaved blacksmith, and he was a cowboy, and he took the opportunity to leave Texas and to go to the Mexicans to have them teach him how he would brand and lasso horses and, do all of this, and the underground expectations and connections between Blacks and Mexicans is also an opportunity to look at.
That's
But I
right.
really appreciate being on with Annette and Kellie Carter as scholars who are leading us into more and more understanding of the moment.
That's
Thank you.
right. So
Yes.
I just need to lift up a big old red big pop to you as we close out this conversation. And I thank you all. That's the end
you
of our
very much.
broadcast, the end of our show. Thanks to all of our guests, and thank you for joining us. Stay with us as we continue our conversation on Facebook and Twitter. We're on Facebook and Twitter with our post show, continuing our discussion on Juneteenth. So, to each of you, how does the Black Lives Matter movement connect now in this moment? I mean, it's all connected, I know that, but I mean, particularly in this moment of heightened interest in a holiday like Juneteenth. I'll start with you, Imari.
I think in Massachusetts, in Boston, we are in the midst of this third Reconstruction. And so the Reconstruction, the other two, after the Civil War, during the Civil Rights Movement, after World War II, and now this emergence of political and civic leaders. And so you see Ayanna Pressley on a large scale stage. You see the next Boston mayor, the current mayor being a Black woman. The next future mayor could be a Black woman. The top law enforcement are African-American males. The DA is a Black woman. Civic leaders, I think this moment from turning into a movement, turning into institutions. And so moments, movements, institutions are sustained through things that are permanent. Organizations, NAACP, King Boston, BECMA, other civic organizations that have emerged as permanent fixtures. I think holidays, symbols are also important fixtures, and Juneteenth is one of those important fixtures. Now, can we sustain this? I surely hope so. Do we need, like a mountain climber, do you need anchors? Do you need things to tether you so that we don't go back beyond this point? We certainly do. And so Juneteenth is one of those moments, one of those fixtures that we can tether ourselves to push us forward. And so I think that's how it's directly related.
Annette, what do you say?
Well, I agree with that. We're in a moment that seems to be transforming right now. I mean, there's an indication that some of the enthusiasm that a number of whites had about a notion of a racial reckoning is kind of dying down a bit. But the holiday, I think, gives people, Black people and white people, an opportunity to think about the question of race and the question of white supremacy and how that was a part of the story of the murder of George Floyd and how people are implicated in that. Not just, but, the sort of, litany of stories about different people who have in their encounters with police. And this notion of thinking about police reform makes you think about Black people's position in the country. And it's not just a matter of the question of whether you can walk around as a citizen. It's a basic function of the basic notion of the function of citizenship that is supposed to give people equal protection and has not. So the idea of the hope that I talked about before of equality that's mentioned in the order and the way people perceive this is something that we've been struggling for. And so, struggling for the, for centuries now. So I think the link is there because it's clear that we are not in a position of the equality that was mentioned in that order or in the declaration for that matter. So those two things naturally go together. Even though, as I said, the enthusiasm for a reckoning seems to be dying down. We'll see what happens with all of these voter suppression moves in the various states to see how people respond to that. But it's definitely linked together.
Kellie?
There was an article, I think, in the New York Times that talked about the anniversary of George Floyd and said that white sentiment had waned or had fallen off, but that solidarity among groups of color, people of color, was stronger than ever, was higher before. Support for Black Lives Matter among Asian groups and Latinx groups was higher than ever before. And I like to think that this can be a holiday that draws in so much solidarity because in some ways we measure everyone's freedom by Black freedom. How free are Black people? That should be a gauge for how free we are as a country. And so in some ways I am encouraged by the solidarity. I'm encouraged by the support of other groups who want to be a part of this call to action to really make sure that everybody is treated as equal citizens. This should really be about the collective and not just about Black experiences because everyone's getting their clocks cleaned by white supremacy. And so I hope that's what this holiday will do.
Lamerchi.
Yes, I agree with both Annette and Kellie, and understand this moment, I think, as another crystal, another one that has all these facets in it that can help us form a lens that all people who have some disadvantage to systemic racism and otherness can use as a lens for themselves to advance us toward more humanism, to be open to each other as we cross differences. This moment for me, as we look at Black Lives Matter, is a real opportunity to, what the young people have said, stay woke, that freedom is illusory at best, that it is not a commodity that you can hold on to and it doesn't move again. There is always movement toward a goal, and freedom is not free. So what are the sacrifices that we're making? What are those things that in the 21st century have aided us in the innovations and technology to be able to see what a 17-year-old young woman has filmed as a moment that's real, that we watch, as Reverend Barber has said from the Poor People's Campaign, is like, why should that have been an opportunity for a 17-year-old young Black woman to see this, to record it, to have it in our face, and then for people to tell us we didn't see what we saw. And so this idea to look at what are the realities we have and what is the hope and the possibilities that we can magnify and lift all people with. So I take it as a part of our framework of the work that we have to do throughout this century, at least. As we get to some more realization, and I have been a participant on the King Boston project, and Imari has really helped us to understand more about Dr. King through his advancements with community. So I'm looking, as Kellie is saying, for this opportunity for communities and neighborhoods that are most impacted by this to join together. So.
I'm wondering, excuse me, what you all think about, just because of the timing, there's been a kind of double whammy this year of history, Black American history, that the wider communities did not know about. We just I've been really hit with a lot of information about the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa massacre, which I was surprised that in my own circle, I think I was one of a very few Black people who knew about it. So this is, there's history that had not been known that's horrific that happened. And what also was not known about it was a lot of cover up about how it happened, why it happened, blah, blah, blah. Not necessarily so much with the question of what happened in Juneteenth, except we have, as you know, 2 years before these people got this information because of the system in which it was set up. So I'm wondering what you all think about now, the unveiling of this history and its impact on people that had no clue and are just trying to process, what this all means. So I'll start with you, Kellie.
This is going to sound bad, but I kind of push back on people not knowing, because I think we have been talking about Tulsa within the academy and outside the academy for decades. It's a staple on a lot of my colleagues' syllabi. There was a huge commission in 1994 to talk about this. I think there's a lot of willful ignorance about this. But I think also how we talk about this is really important. We almost mark this as a tragedy because it represents Black wealth, but I push back on that too, because Black poor people matter, and Black poor people died in Tulsa too and had their homes taken from them too, whether it was owned property or rented property. And so I want this to be something that people acknowledge, that yes, we have been talking about this. Yes, there are a plethora of books about Tulsa. Yes, you can do a Google search and find tons of things on Tulsa, but also to limit it to the specialness because of wealth, because of Black Wall Street, I think does a disservice to the hundreds of people who lost their lives or property that weren't of any significant means that still had value.
Well, I'm raising this because, for many reasons. I'm in a station with people who are, I would say, more highly informed than the general population. I am telling you, people were, what is Juneteenth? I am stunned I have never heard of Tulsa. This is revelatory for them. These are educated people, college educated in many instances. And the other day I was listening to Clint Smith. He just wrote this book, How the Word Is Passed. And he talked about going to Monticello. This is Annette's territory, and being on tour as they discussed, Thomas Jefferson enslaving people, many people, and that's how he got his wealth. And he watched the faces of two of the women on tour literally freak out. And he went up to them afterwards and said, what distressed you about this? They said, we didn't know he owned slaves. I mean, I am telling you, so that's why I'm asking the question. So Annette, you get to take a crack at this.
Kellie, I think with all due respect, you're a professor, you're in academia, you would be startled the things that people don't know. Haven't you seen these things when they go around and ask people who the vice president is and people don't know who he is? I mean,
yeah, I'm in a bubble.
You're in a bubble here. And so I think that a lot of people we follow all these kinds of things. This is, we're interested in this stuff, but a lot of people don't know a lot of stuff. And it is interesting to think of all of this coming to, it is a double whammy to have the intense interest in Juneteenth and Tulsa, 100 years. And why not 99, 98, 100? That's the way we think about things, tens, and that's what we commemorate these things that way. But the only thing I will say about the Wall Street aspect of it that I find interesting, the notion of Black Wall Street, is that today people complain and say, well, Black people have things because the government is giving you things. You're getting stuff from the government. And then there's resentment of us. In this situation, a number of white people evidently resented that a group of Black people had done things on their own. So you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. If you think the government is giving you stuff, then you're to be despised. If you do stuff on your own, you're to be despised. I mean, that's the only thing to me about focusing on that, is that it really shows you this notion that it's about, Black you don't achieve, you don't do, this is the reason we don't like you, is not true at all. It's just plain white supremacy. These people they don't want you to, it's like they don't want us to have anything. Mm-hmm. So that's the only reason to, I think you're absolutely right. We shouldn't focus on the idea that it's especially bad because some wealthy people got hurt. But for me, it really is a lesson about how people feel about Blacks. No matter what we do, there are going to be people who feel that we are inferior and we shouldn't, and we should be subordinate to them.
Yeah. And stories are important to culture, right? And, we grew up that, the Pilgrims came here and they broke bread with Native Americans, and that was the first Thanksgiving, and everyone was happy that George Washington couldn't tell a lie and he didn't chop down the cherry tree. And so these stories, which are a part of the American mythos, provide people with capital, right? And so if people don't have stories, they don't know their origin, and they can't get the type of cultural capital from these stories, it doesn't empower them. And so in this time when we're talking about interrogating racism, of course, we're talking about police reform. Of course, we're talking about education reform. But I think what we're doing now is illuminating the importance of Black joy, illuminating the importance of well-being, and then illuminating the importance of how stories socialize folks into white supremacy. As a white person, it socializes you into a belief system that you are superior. And for Black folks, when we don't know these stories, it socializes us into a position of minoritized status. And so I think the emergence of these stories in this moment is also about this counter storytelling that activists are engaged in. We know we have to not only focus on policy, focus on systemic dismantling of white supremacy, but we have to illuminate our stories through holidays, symbols, and our history.
So, Lamerchi, how do you see about this, the impact of this history reveal for most people outside of Kelly's bubble who don't know nothing about either one of these?
Well, I think just as you bring up Thomas Jefferson in 1785 in his notes on the state of Virginia, he absolutely says that Phyllis Wheatley cannot be a poet, that Black people have no imagination. And so from that time, as this record is, going around in our heads and making us think that there are no possibilities that there can be an entrepreneurial community in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that has the ability to raise funds, to be its own agent, to be impacted by Jim Crow and react positively on their own selfhood and self-possessiveness, that I think there's selective hearing because there's not the possibility that this could be so. So people are surprised because there has not been at the foundational thinking of who people are in America, that hyphenated American people are people are Italian hyphen American, people are African hyphen American, people are German hyphen American. In that hyphen is our commonality. And those commonalities help us to understand what is our possibilities. But when that has been blocked, there is the notion that this couldn't be. This is not possible. So whatever aspect and tributary we look at Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the 50 towns in Oklahoma that were free Black towns, people say, what? What kind of notion is that? It's not the record they've heard. So
let me follow up and ask, because I've been asking pretty much everybody I've talked to in the past year of the quote, racial reckoning. And this is non-scientific, so scholars don't run. If you have a sense that, unlike at the beginning, I would say, I don't know, even 3 years ago, if you have a conversation with people about racism and you said systemic, people really did not grasp that. Most folks would say, well, no, if so-and-so was never mean to me, I'm not racist, I didn't do that. So the concept of systemic racism and how it's embedded in institutions and in the fabric of our society was really quite foreign and rejected out of hand. My sense, but I'm curious about yours as people who sit and sift through all of this and all this history, is that not huge numbers, but people have a sense of now, if you say systemic racism, what that means. Imari, do you have that sense, or am I just one alone here?
I think it's different. And for the first time in a presidential acceptance speech, we heard the incoming president acknowledge systemic racism as an American challenge. We're hearing the healthcare profession acknowledge systemic racism as a public health crisis. And so it is more common in people's everyday frame to at least hear systemic racism. Now, whether they understand what systemic racism is another thing.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, Annette, you take a crack at it. What's your sense?
Well, I think people don't know. I have a better sense of what it means now. And I think talking about Tulsa and talking about Juneteenth gives them a way into understanding what we're talking about. That this is something that has been in the country from the very beginning. And it sort of embedded in the way people think about race and think about people and a hierarchy of people. So I think it's something that people have a better understanding of. I can't imagine people talking about this, 10 years ago in the same kind of way. Mm-hmm. And I do think it's significant whether the president, fully understands, is what he means by all of this. The very fact that it was raised shows that we've moved to a different place and, that we weren't before.
Yes.
Kellie.
Yeah, I was trying not to laugh at a comment on Facebook because a friend of a friend had posted, wait, systemic racism ended with Brown v. Board, right?
Okay.
Yeah. No, that's not what we mean.
Okay.
That people do understand, they understand racism in terms of like the hardness of unfair laws or Jim Crow segregation or the very blatant forms of it that I think are impossible to navigate around. But what we don't always understand is how much racism is so much, it's gravity. It's that invisible force that is holding so many of Americans down, that is oftentimes difficult to sometimes pinpoint, especially for those who are privileged and not paying attention or unwilling to pay attention to the ways that people of color have been harmed by these systems, by this structure.
Okay, and Lamerchi?
In tandem with what Kellie was just saying, thinking about slavery as a contract, thinking about how the laws of slavery make this so complex because it is an unjust system, number one. And when people are taught that America is the greatest and it's had this very wide constitution that has elastic clauses and all of that speak to what the laws are here, to realize that there hasn't been an agreement in this contract, that racism is advancing because there has been no reckoning with, well, what do we agree is right? What do we agree is just? There's still this reckoning with the foundational theories of race that as a deconstruction, as a construction, support this white superiority, support this white possessive thinking in kidnapping and taking people as property, being deemed property, being divested of property, and then trying to find a sense of belonging within that system. And then most people are saying, well, all of that's not possible. That can't be possible. Is it racism continually that we'll have to debunk? Of course, because at a foundation, if something is built on that core, you have to constantly understand. You can't address every issue of an instance of it, but foundationally, we have to reckon with that this is a racially unfair, biased, systemic thing that is like a monster that we have to now somehow slay.
Okay, What's one thing, each of you, briefly, you want to make sure African Americans treasure about Juneteenth? Briefly, Imari.
See, I was hoping to go first other times, but this one, so I could do some mental gymnastics, but you called on me. I think one of the things that's important for us to hold center in this holiday is our joy and well-being.
Okay.
Like this is about our joy and well-being, and we unapologetically should have it.
All right.
Black joy is an act of resistance.
Okay. Lamerchi?
Well, I when you asked that, I thought about the rapper Malik B, and he says we're living in the calculus, and how to solve this with love. Mel King says the question, love is the question and the answer. So Black love and embracing ourselves, I think, is what I would say and want to project.
Kellie?
Resiliency, that even in the midst of death and delays, we will not be crushed.
And Annette, last word from the author of On Juneteenth.
Black love, Black joy, and resiliency. Can't say it any better than those things.
And you all
Amen.
said it very well, so I thank you for joining me.
Thank you.